Today, we are diving into artificial intelligence and one of its biggest, boldest promises, transparency. You know, the idea that AI should be able to explain itself. But what if the very tools we're building to create that transparency have a massive hidden blind spot? To really get this, we gotta start with the core idea itself. There's this whole field in tech dedicated to basically creating a why button for the algorithms that are, let's be honest, kind of starting to run our world. I mean, you've definitely felt this, right? Why on earth did my streaming service recommend that show? Or, on a more serious note, how exactly did the bank decide my loan application? We all have this natural human need to understand the reasoning behind decisions that affect us, and it doesn't matter if that decision comes from a person or a machine. And that's exactly where this concept comes in, explainable AI, or XAI for short. The best way to think about it is like your old math teacher telling you to show your work. XAI is basically a set of tools that makes an algorithm do just that. It forces it to reveal the logic behind its answers. It's supposed to be all about building trust and being transparent. So in this explainer, here's our game plan. We're going to uncover a really glaring blind spot in this whole quest for transparency. Then we'll see how one team of researchers put it to the test, unpack their honestly surprising findings, and figure out what it's really going to take to build a more inclusive AI. All right, so here's the catch. While the whole point of XAI is to make artificial intelligence understandable for everyone, it turns out the entire field has been, well, overlooking a huge part of the population. To put this in perspective, just think about this number. According to the World Health Organization, there are at least 2.2 billion people around the world with some form of vision impairment. That is a massive slice of the global population, and guess what? They use AI systems just like everybody else. Okay, so keep that 2.2 billion number in your head. Now get this. When researchers took a deep dive and reviewed 79 major studies on explainable AI, they found something that was, frankly, a pretty shocking oversight. And this quote from the researchers really just hits the nail on the head. The very field that's dedicated to making AI transparent had completely failed to make its own tools accessible. That promise of explainability, it just wasn't being extended to this community at all. And here's the why behind the why. The problem is that somewhere along the line, interpretability became pretty much the same thing as visualization. So all these popular XAI tools, you might have heard of them, things like Shop and Lime, they almost always spit out their answers as visual things. Complicated charts, graphs, colorful heat maps, which are great if you can see them. But for someone who relies on a screen reader, they're often just a wall of silence. So with this huge gap sitting there wide open, a research team decided to do what almost no one had done before, to actually investigate how to make these AI explanations accessible. And this is the important part, to test their ideas with the people who would actually use them. And their approach was just so thoughtful. First, they looked at real-world AI systems to see what's out there. Then, they created a very specific user persona to keep their work grounded in reality. From there, they actually designed and built an accessible prototype. And finally, they put it in front of both accessibility experts and users with sight loss to get honest, direct feedback. And to make this all super concrete, they came up with Caroline. So Caroline is a 45-year-old traffic manager who happens to be blind. Her job relies on an AI system that predicts traffic flow, so she absolutely needs to understand why that system is making its recommendations. This persona just immediately pulls the problem out of the abstract and makes it so much more human. And here you can see the actual tool they built for Caroline. It's a prototype of a traffic management system. You can see it's laid out with tables predicting things like traffic flow based on data inputs. But the key thing here is that it was built from the ground up to work with screen readers. This allows a user like Caroline to navigate all of this data and, most importantly, actually access the AI's explanations. So they had the prototype. It was ready to go. The researchers set up a co-design session with users who had lived experience with sight loss. And the feedback they got? It was fascinating. And in some ways, it was completely counterintuitive. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. The researchers tested two different ways to explain the AI's logic. On the left, you see a pretty complex scatter plot. It technically has more data points and more detail. But on the right, you see a much simpler bar chart, which just shows the average importance of the same factors. So the big question was, which one is actually more useful?
And here it is, the key finding. Every single participant agreed. Even though those detailed charts had more information, the simplified bar charts were way easier to understand. For non-visual comprehension, just throwing more data at someone is not the answer. Turns out, clarity and simplicity are way, way more valuable.
This comparison just perfectly shows the power of co-design. I mean, look at this. The version on the left was an early draft, but after they talked to accessibility experts, they made these crucial changes you see on the right. They fixed a confusing label that was just plain wrong, and they seriously boosted the color contrast to make it more readable for users with low vision. Simple changes that make a world of difference. So yeah, this research might be preliminary, but its implications are absolutely profound. You can think of it as a huge call to action for the entire AI development world to stop treating accessibility like some checkbox you take at the end and start building it in from the very, very beginning.
So, what's the big takeaway here? Well, this research gives us a pretty clear path forward. First, a one-size-fits-all visual-first approach is just guaranteed to fail. Instead, we need to lean into simpler, more linear formats. Also, co-designing with the disability community, not just for them, is totally non-negotiable. And finally, we have to think multimodal, using text, sound, maybe even haptics, so that everyone can understand the why behind an AI's decision.
And this leaves us with a really critical question we all have to think about. As AI continues to weave itself into the very fabric of our lives, making huge decisions in our healthcare, our finances, even our justice system, we have to stop and ask ourselves, are we building a future that's transparent and accessible for just some of us? Or are we truly building it for everyone?